Today, a Banking Royal Commission special report. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest report covering finance and property news, and this is a special edition to cover the final release from the Royal Commission. The report was published earlier on today, and I've now had a chance to read it at some length. So what I want to do is just go through some of the main items and also highlight what I think some of the key implications will be. So just as a quick reminder, the Royal Commission, of course, ran for a considerable length of time using a case study approach where effectively they asked banks to come clean on the various issues relating to financial services, and that also covered wealth management and insurance. And also they spoke to the regulators too. And it really was an unhappy expose. And the final report really picks up from where the interim report got to, insofar that they highlight the poor behaviour, the illegal practices, and underscore again that the whole thing was very much driven by greed. Now, of course, greed is fundamentally linked to the way capitalism works. So, in a way, their observation is that unfettered capitalism has created the problem. Anyhow, the final report today has gone through a number of critical recommendations, and it's worth saying that there are some very significant things not covered. For example, the report doesn't talk about structural separation or horizontal or vertical disintegration. Neither does it get into a lot of detail with regard to who may be taken to court, although they do say that more than 20 entities should be referred back to ASIC and APRA for potential court action later. But what I want to do is to focus in on those things which the report does say, because there are some material points which will fundamentally change the way that financial services works down the track. And of course, Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, also spoke about it tonight and did say that he thought this was a critical turning point with regard to the question of trust in financial services. And absolutely, there is a trust question to be addressed here, because the level of mistrust in the community with regard to the financial services providers is remarkably high. So, at a top level, I think there are four critical areas to explore. The first is the observation that fundamentally the law does not need to be changed in the round, particularly around responsible lending. The main issues are not the law itself, but more the way that the law is interpreted and policed. So the report doesn't recommend a fundamental change to lending practices. The second observation is that there is a significant amount of criticism with regard to mortgage brokers and the conflicted remuneration, and a plan that suggests ultimately mortgage brokers should be remunerated by a fixed fee from consumers. And the report lays out a 3 or perhaps 5-year plan to get to that end game. So no immediate changes, but there will be a series of steps taken over the next few years which will fundamentally change the remuneration model, because, as the report says, currently mortgage brokers are completely conflicted, because the bigger the loan, the bigger the repayment they get, and they might be persuaded perhaps to offer loans to consumers that weren't necessarily best for the consumer. And that's the other point about mortgage brokers. There is going to be a best interest requirement, which of course is already in place in the financial planning sector. And what that means is that mortgage brokers now will need to have the best interests of customers in mind. And frankly, that's probably something that most people would assume would have been there anyway. Now, with regard to responsible lending, the whole question of not unsuitable lending is very much going to stay as it is. But they do specifically talk about the household expenditure measure backstop, because of course we know that in the past many loans were written at rates of expenditure estimate that were so low as to be laughable. Now, what the report has said is that there may be some space for an HEM type structure going forward, but it needs to be at a much more realistic level. And it also says that actually lenders need to make more inquiries to satisfy the not unsuitable hurdle. And also in the report, they mention the ASIC Westpac case and makes the point that should that case get to the point where effectively HEM looks as though it could be regarded as an acceptable hurdle, then they say that the law should be changed to bring it up to a more sensible level. So I don't see here any specific sense that we're going to suddenly find that the lending taps are unleashed. And in fact, the banks will continue their tighter lending standards, looking at expenses in more detail, looking at income in more detail, and making sure that the loan is not unsuitable. Now, the next area to look at is that of governance. And of course, the BEAR, which is effectively the APRA-led corporate behaviour standards, are going to be expanded into the wealth management and insurance sector. Now, of course, we've talked about BEAR before, and there are some limitations to it, but it's better than nothing. But this takes us to a very critical point, and that is that the Commission said that really it's down to the cultural and behavioural norms within the corporate sector. And that then puts the acid back on the executives in the lending institutions and investment houses and wealth management offices, and of course the boards, who clearly now have a stronger set of accountabilities around the behaviour within their organisations. In a way, it does put the emphasis in the right place. It should be the weight of effort inside the organisation. But of course, cultural change takes a long, long time. And frankly, there's always a problem that corporate behaviour may slide backwards over time. And that takes us to the next point, that the whole point of regulators, and the fact that both ASIC and APRA are criticised severely in the report, underscores the fact that they really have not done their job. Specifically, they've not used the power of the courts to enforce the law. So the report says that ASIC and APRA need to be more forceful in their use of the law, rather than reaching accommodative agreements with people who perhaps have broken the rules. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Now, as part of that, they haven't changed the ASIC and APRA Twin Peak regulatory frameworks, but they have said there's a need to clarify more clearly the roles between those two entities, and they also are recommending the creation of a super regulator, somebody that sits effectively above both of the organisations, and to make sure that they are behaving effectively and that the roles and responsibilities are clear. That's probably very sensible. And remember, that's precisely what David Murray recommended in terms of some mechanism to ensure that the regulatory frameworks are actually in train. And of course, the government threw that one out last time around. At least this time, the government has said that they're going to implement, to at least some extent, all the recommendations. And in fact, there are 76 specific recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all, you'll be pleased to hear, but I will put a link through to the report at the bottom of this so that if you want to, you can go and have a look yourselves. So we've talked about lending behaviour, we've talked about mortgage brokers. We should also talk about financial planning and wealth managers, because there are some changes there in terms of abolishing some of the old commission structures that are still in existence, and making it clearer about the roles and obligations of advisors in the wealth management sector. And there's also some changes to the governance structures as well to ensure that there is less conflict of interest between the interests of particular savers within, for example, a wealth management structure, and also the broader entity that's managing the funds for those particular individuals. And the final point relates to compensation and remediation. And the government's picked this up and said that there will be an additional entity, an industry-funded entity, that can provide compensation when industry players do wrong by their customers. And so bringing all this up to the end of the conversation, it is fundamentally trying to shift the dial back towards the consumer, saying that the entities within the financial services sector should be acting in the interest of the consumers. That should go without saying. That they must not trade off benefits to consumers and outcomes to consumers with profit enhancement. Now, of course, that in a way pulls right against the idea of profit maximisation, which is, of course, what up till now the entities have been doing. So it does mark a very significant change of tune, and we'll be very interested to see to what extent this sticks inside the sector. So, standing back, my conclusion is that working within the legal frameworks that the inquiry was set up to do, and considering the range of issues that they thought about, they've actually done a reasonable job. It's probably worth saying that this is not a radical departure or radical shake-up to the entire structure of the industry. But nevertheless, the nuance and focus around the customer is significantly different from where we've come from. And it certainly could benefit the broader Australian community if, in fact, we get better value financial services products delivered to people who need them appropriately. And the final point to make is that this doesn't, to my mind, fundamentally change the lending environment. I don't think we're going to see a sudden flood of loans back on the table. Now, remember that APRA has already tightened the regulations as well. So I think that this should not be seen as a substantial switch in lending behaviour, such that, for example, home prices might rise. But I also think that profitability of the sector will be under severe pressure because the estimated amount of remediation, if you add it all up, could be as high as $6 or $7 billion across the industry. And we may even have not got it all then. And of course, the amount of effort and time that's going to be required to pull these behaviours into line will be substantial. Leadership has to take account. It has to come from the top. And so I'll be very interested to see to what extent the leaders inside our organisations are able to embrace the quantum of change required. And then just to round this out, of course there's an election coming quite soon, and all of these major changes will need to be legislated in some way. And I suspect that quite a lot of this will be slowed up and probably will not really come into being for some time ahead. But nevertheless, the trajectory is relatively clear. And in fact, both sides of politics have pretty much undertaken to implement all the recommendations. So kudos to Hayne and his team. I think they've done Australia a great service. Now, of course, the rubber hits the road, and we'll see whether there is the political will and the ability of the financial services industry itself to really change, or whether we will slide back to the same old in a few years. Well, I, for one, will be keeping a very close eye on what happens next. If you'd like the post, please share it, add a comment or question. I read them all. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so to receive future updates. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching. I'll talk to you again next time.